All right, how is everyone doing today? And welcome to my channel. These are educational videos that uh, I'm putting out there because I want you to learn about some things that you probably haven't learned about before because they are pretty obscure, mostly theories of everything, great theories of everything, ancient and modern, and they're intended to help you with your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health, your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, and your formation of a holistic worldview. And today is our 20th video that we have done on the book called It's After the End of the World. Don't you know that yet? Excuse me. And this book is on two groups of relatively unknown jazz musicians in Chicago in the 1950s and 60s. And we're in chapter 5, which is on the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, or AACM. And we're about to start a section called the AACM on Delmark, which is a record label. On the Delmark recordings, the musicians took many steps to get the listener to access concentration. First, they used invocation to immerse the listener into the idea of ritual. Second, the musicians used their own lives as examples to convince the audience of their sincerity and worthiness. The musicians also gave instruction in the liner notes of many albums, so the listeners would be clear that they were not dealing with a secular jazz record, but something that requires more from them. These properties can be seen in the early Delmarks, and in particular in the first record, the Roscoe Mitchell Sextet's Sound album, 1966. Sound was the first recorded break from the jazz free of New York, primarily through an exploration of various textures, shapes, and colors of sound. The presence of an esoteric order was clear in the liner notes, which called the music a warlock's brew. In these notes, J.B. Fiji calls Mitchell's group a holy artistic family that dances through the daydreams of certain seers of New York, where the climate of rampant ego would alone void such visions. Each of the tracks also shows an intention toward petition through repeated plays, an inversion of the uses of recording technology. The album's title work, Sound, represented its name in that it was a 26-minute exploration of different combinations of diverse, unpredictable sounds. Instruments made different sounds from what would normally be expected, playing in extreme registers or with unorthodox techniques like using the bass as a drum. The sounds were used for shading and coloring, and they were often used to add shape or texture and were not strictly recognizable, classifiable sounds. The sounds could also serve to induce careful listening. The record featured a good deal of soft playing, a strategic discipline that induces focus so that the listener is tricked in a way into accessing concentration. While much of the New York jazz free music emphasized extended improvised solos, Sound evidenced no long solo expeditions. It was also lighter and more humorous than most New York jazz free. The Little Suite invoked the carnivalesque throughout with whistles, rattles, and other noisemakers. Suite implied that the music was a complete whole, not a sectioned work edited for institutional recording discipline, but an important strategy of documentation. One downbeat reviewer sensed a part of the AACM mission when he argued that Little Suite was telling us, quote, what happens when group consciousness appears. Another piece in sound is a tribute to Ornette Coleman, not an interpretation of one of his songs, but a portrait Ornette. Mitchell admits that before his own transformation, he too used to make fun of Coleman's playing, but sounds Ornette indicates a kinship in creativity, though not a derivative source. Coleman was an inspiration. The AACM was moving beyond what the New Yorkers had done. Beyond freeing the music, the AACM sought to actually use the spiritual dimensions of music as a long-term strategy for leading the listener from the secular constraints to higher states of consciousness. In late 1966, Delmark released a second AACM effort, Joseph Jarman's Song for FOR, which featured several other heralded players, along with a continuing exploration into petition through recording. Jarman's poem, Non-Cognitive Aspects of the City, weaves poetry into a tapestry of sound that expressed the urban landscape as he describes it metaphorically. Jarman's impressionistic poem was a creative extension of the music. As Alden Lynn Nielsen has argued, jazz poetry has been badly misrepresented by the beat generation under a cool worldview. Quote, the sweat-shirted, goateed, sunglasses-wearing, coolly detached bongo player was such a familiar sight behind beat poets that Hollywood films and television programs made a stock comic character of the figure. In the 1960s, that cliche transformed into another dashiki-clad, goateed, sunglasses-wearing, coolly detached conga player behind the militant black poet. By contrast, says Nielsen, Jarman and other black experimentalists have taken musical presentation of texts far outside of anything attempted by the beats. Parts of Jarman's poem serve as examples of using the verbal to get to the nonverbal. Quote, non-cognitive, these elements, internal, these states on planes far out, is what these lives become. Thought's final last word. Moreover, Jarman mixes the poetry seamlessly with the music, and he uses the voice to drive the rhythm of the song at several points. Poetry had been used in New York Jazz Free, but not to highlight the nonverbal. In addition, Jarman reminded the listener visually that Song 4 had a different purpose, invoking ritual-like participation from the audience. The cover is a photograph of Jarman in African face paint and headdress. As we have seen, for Jarman, face paint was important from a ritual aspect to subjugate the personality of Jarman to his ritual function. Theatrical elements, however, often came off better in live performance than on record. Still, the liner notes clarified the purpose and commented on the esoteric, urging the listener to dig deeper by saying that Song 4 has no meaning outside of itself. The recordings and influence of younger members, Mitchell and Jarman, left no bitterness in the minds of the older, still unrecognized musicians. Muhal Richard Abrams saw to it that any member's success was seen as a victory for the entire AACM. Leo Smith remembered, quote, there was no dissension because we knew that whoever got out there was going to represent the AACM well. Even though Abrams was clearly the authority and leader in the experimental band, he did not begrudge the successes of his younger associates, and he ensured that other musicians would not either. Toward the end of 1967, at age 37, Abrams finally documented his own creativity when he brought several young musicians into the studio with him to record his first album as a leader, Levels and Degrees of Light, on Delmark. For Abrams, His petition began with the album cover painting, an abstract figure holding an Egyptian Ankh cross displayed with several other Hermetic symbols. Abrams believed that creativity was indivisible, so while he was teaching creative music, he was also instrumental in getting other musicians involved with painting. Abrams also included poetry on his debut album, verse with diet-like metaphysics. My thoughts are my future, now and forever, symbolizing the signs of the past, present, and future in the eternal now, singing the bird song in its odyssey through the levels and degrees of light in the eternal now and then. 3 degrees and seven suns before eternity. Abrams delineated the contours of inner space and pointed to the Egyptian Hermetic principle, as above, so below. In the higher states of awareness, things are not chaotic and incomprehensible. They just seem that way at first. There are higher planes and lower planes, but according to the universal law, the rules are the same in all. The first piece, Levels and Degrees of Light, began with a percussive invocation to ritual with extreme sounds and only an implicit pulse. The title track then featured wordless vocals by Penelope Taylor, one of several female singers and dancers in the AACM. Wordless female vocals became a trademark of the AACM, particularly in Abrams's recorded work. The album also included the 23-minute Bird Song, another piece that included poetry. Only this time, poet David Moore recited his piece over silence for several minutes before Abrams' group followed with a long advance into abstraction, complete with bird calls. The final track offered some of Abrams' poetry and included his percussive piano playing. When the album was reviewed in Downbeat, however, it did not even receive a rating. The reviewer blames Abrams, Custer, and the engineer for allowing the album to be released when it was, quote, afflicted with some of the worst echo I have ever heard, which made it difficult to differentiate the notes that are being played from the echoes of the previous notes, end quote. The truth was, however, that these terrible echo chamber effects were, quote, engineered in at Abrams' request. As noted earlier, Sun Ra tried to break with slick recording conventions by trying to draw attention to rather than disguise the recording technology. Abrams might have had similar intentions. Alternatively, he might have wanted to create an effect that, quote, made it difficult to differentiate the notes that are being played from the echoes of the previous notes, especially given that it was entitled The Bird Song. My copy of the recording, in fact, does sound like birds chirping, but the reverberation has been engineered out. Perhaps it was fitting that on the same page of that 1968 issue of Downbeat, longtime critic Bill Mathieu, Mathieu, announced his resignation, feeling that, quote, I've joined the ranks of those who can no longer write rating-oriented criticism. I don't know how to bring heaven down to this green earth, but for me, writing rating-oriented criticism definitely doesn't feel like the way to do it. I had the makings of a perfect music critic. Now I think that this was a rationalization, that I really enjoyed being in the judge's seat. I used to think, but if I don't do it, someone else less well-equipped will botch the job. Now I see how well this concern protected my position. Mathieu was so affected by this new way of making music that 23 years later, he also wrote a book about it called The Listening Book, 1991. One passage flashes back to a conversion experience, perhaps referring to Mitchell's sound record, one of the last he reviewed. Quote, I began to hear music differently. I began to hear something in sound I had never heard before, to experience in the very act of hearing an upward intention, as if some current were drawing us toward it. I learned that sound is alive. I learned that sound itself is a purposeful life, and that music is the evolution of that purpose. I found my own purpose hidden in the swell, my pure chord in the roar of waters. My music and my life began to grow reciprocally, like longtime lovers who grow to look alike. End quote. Whether it was the Mitchell LP or not, Matthew was one of the critics who began to contact his higher self through creative music. Two of the next AACM collaborations with Delmark came from young saxophonist Anthony Braxton, whose three compositions of New Jazz, 1968, and For Alto, 1969, reveal an insight into the earliest work of a young AACM member who is now a highly influential leader of creative music throughout the world. As of this 2004 writing, no fewer than 5 books have been devoted to writing about Braxton's life and music, though there has not been a single book written about the AACM as a whole. That's as of 2004, that was true. George Lewis put out the kind of definitive book on the AACM a few years later. Braxton's conspicuous fame is anomalous within the AACM, pointing to Braxton's anomalous nature as an outspoken musician within a group that often lets its music speak for itself. Several elements within 3 compositions show Braxton's earliest attempts at recording for the strategy of petition. First, however, Braxton learned that musicians needed to make several adjustments between performing and recording. Quote, when I first got into the recording studio, he said, I attempted to blow the walls down and it ended up sounding quite different. Also betraying his inexperience, he decided to use the term new jazz in the title, a term he later rejected, saying, quote, the music we play is not new, but very ancient. Continuing with a verbal edge that was somewhat uncharacteristic of the AACM, and that might have underestimated the power of the forces in opposition to him. In the liner notes, he proclaimed, quote, we're on the eve of the complete fall of Western values, end quote. By his own reckoning, his first petition was slightly off the mark, revealing youthful enthusiasm and only a short stint in the AACM since 1967. The album still presented many other important facets of creative music. 3 compositions used new strategies for embedding polyrhythms within the music. The album was notable for its lack of a drummer and bassist. This was another innovation beyond New York Jazz Free, which freed drummers and bassists from the lead instruments, but was not free of drummers, bassists, or pianists to get some kind of a rhythm. Violinist Leroy Jenkins and trumpeter Leo Smith played with Braxton on the entire album, foregoing the standard saxophone bass drums format. Braxton averred an AACM dictum that pointed to time's hidden dimensions. Quote, tempo is a limited use of time. Consistent with the AACM's use of internal time, linear time was just the tip of the iceberg for Braxton. The second track also featured the piano playing of Abrams, who provided a percussive voice through his rhythmic expansion and contraction on the 88 tune drums of the piano. Abrams' presence also demonstrates how a leader can abdicate authority and operate in a participant role, another departure from most New York Jazz Free. An additional element of shifting participatory leadership is the fact that the final track, The Bell, was composed by a new voice in the AACM, Leo Smith. 3 compositions also puts listeners face to face with Braxton's cryptic symbolic notation. Track 1 and Track 2 are both entitled Through the Use of Nonverbal Symbols. Braxton felt that by 1966, his conventional titles were becoming irrelevant. Quote, the titles really didn't have anything to do with what I was really doing. It might be something that you could refer to as a title, but it wasn't really anything to do with the actual music. For him, language was, quote, a factor that obstructed what I want to say. So he started experimenting with symbols, which he eventually systematized in the 1970s. Words did not convey the meaning he sought because words were secondary to the esoteric science. As Leo Smith explained, quote, any advanced student of mysticism or metaphysical science could readily read the code and symbolism embedded in his titles. The universal way of transmitting absolute laws of nature is through the use of symbols that are derived from an esoteric system in combination with the dot, curve, and straight line. Letters and numbers provide the outside meaning of this language. Braxton's For Alto 1969 record was a double album of solo saxophone work that was quite controversial and was rejected as self-indulgent by many commentators and musicians. One downbeat critic, however, understood the need to defer to creative music. Quote, Anthony Braxton is a living, breathing player whose work, like that of so many of the avant-garde, is of an extremely personal nature. By fully exposing his inner emotions, Braxton has left himself vulnerable to criticism. Yet, it is unfair to express criticism of honesty. If there are faults, the listener has little choice but to overlook them, because they are expressions of personal experiences and feelings which only Braxton himself can judge properly. End quote. Here was one critic who was able to see it from the musician's point of view. But there were many others who were still willing to express criticism of honesty. Braxton himself called this stance the critic's, quote, God position. Another early Delmark recording that was set upon petitioning audiences was Caliprouche Maurice McIntyre's Forces and Feelings, 1970. In the song Sunspots, Rita Warford sings a veritable litany of how one could go about connecting with the higher self. Quote, run in the morning, breathe in the morning, fast and pray and chant, take deep breaths, breathe real deep. Music is the healing force. Bathe in the sunshine, herbs for healing, music for healing. The music was played at a frenetic pace, with the vocals and rhythm inspiring catharsis. The AACM groups have continued to record on the Delmark label throughout the years since 1966, but their albums have gone on to be accepted as important documents for further meditation, study, and exploration among spiritual seekers and younger musicians today, just as the musicians predicted when they employed petition through repetition. Okay, this section is the conclusion of Chapter 5. By looking at the AACM's early years, we can see the daunting task they set for themselves and the opposition and inertia they faced. Lester Bowie tried to summarize the external thrust of the AACM. Quote, spiritually, we're trying to create new forms. We're trying to create a situation in which we can make livings doing that. For Braxton, the goal was, quote, the formation of new gods through, quote, the mystical and spiritual reevaluation of all earth religions, in which the forming of a world music is inevitable, with creativity as the center factor in the birth of a universal religion. With such ideals, the AACM did not have time to relax on early successes. Instead, they had to grow inward and outward, backward and forward. Bowie continued, quote, "We're trying to transmit. We're talking about the ancient African ways, African traditions, the African forms of music, and at the same time, we're talking about the regular, old, everyday ways of life and expression, and at the same time, trying to research our way into the future." Roscoe Mitchell also pointed toward the AACM's expansive mission when he explained, quote, "All the music that has been played or ever will be played is in the universe." That basically musicians are people who take these sounds from the universe and arrange them and bring them down to the listener on earth. That's basically what music is, just the sounds of the universe. Starting in 1965, the AACM tried to publicly present to and petition Americans by transferring these sounds of the universe into a mostly nonverbal human language, creative music. Beginning in 1969, their mission became international in scope, the subject of Chapter 6. Well, I think we will stop there. I think our next door neighbor is practicing his shooting, and he should have scheduled that with me. We could have, synced ourselves up. Anyway, thanks for tuning in today. If you'd like a discography of all this different music, all the most important recordings, so-called, of the music that is being discussed in this book, if you Venmo or Cash App me $1 or more, I'll send you one. And otherwise, please stay tuned for tomorrow. We will be starting Chapter 6, and that features a lot of discussions from the AACM's forays in Europe and other continents. And so please come back and tune in. Otherwise, thanks and have a great day.